The prairie stretched in every direction like a vast, unbroken ocean of golden dust, rippling under the slow breath of the August wind. To most men, it was empty. To him, it was everything. The cowboy had not spoken to another living soul in 10 years, unless you counted the occasional mutter to his horses, or the low, habitual greeting he gave the rising sun each morning. His name had not been spoken aloud by anyone in nearly as long. Out here a man could shed the skin of his old life and let the world forget him. He had done just that. His cabin was a patchwork thing, part built by his own hands, part left over from whoever had tried and failed to tame this land before him. Its boards had been sanded down by a decade of wind-blown grit. The door leaned slightly to the right, its hinges groaning in the mornings like an old man's knees. From the porch, a narrow view cut through the grasslands toward a dry creek bed, beyond which rose a low ridge that seemed always to hold the last light of the day. That ridge was the boundary of his world. He had not crossed it in 10 years. Each morning began the same, not because he loved routine, but because out here, routine was survival. At first light, before the sun was even visible, the coyotes would quiet and the sky would begin to pale. He would swing his legs from the narrow bed in the corner, pull on his boot scuffed, cracked, and shaped perfectly to his feet tanned, shrugged into a shirt gone thin at the elbows. He would set a tin pot on the iron stove and scoop in grounds from a small jar, filling it with water from the barrel he kept indoors to spare himself the early morning walk to the well. While the coffee heated, he'd check his rifle out of habit, not because he expected trouble, but because trouble had a way of showing up uninvited in this land. He tended his horses next. There were 3 now, a sturdy bay mare named Cinder, a slow but steady gelding called Jasper, and a younger roan. He'd broken himself, still with more fire than manners. He'd murmur to them as he filled their trough, brushing dust from their coats, his hands knowing every scar and ridge of muscle. He'd built the corral himself, driving each post into the earth under a summer sun so fierce he'd half wondered if he'd drop dead before the last rail was nailed in. Those rails were still holding strong, a reminder that some things, if built right, could endure. Breakfast was whatever he had on hand, usually beans, sometimes bread if he'd baked the day before, and once in a while, strips of salted venison left from the last hunt. He ate slowly, not because there was any reason to linger, but because in solitude, meals became the clock by which the day was marked. With no one to talk to, the sounds of eating spoon on tin, the scrape of bread crust against teeth, the silence was never oppressive to him. It had been his choice. After all, the seasons had been his only companions. He could read the land as easily as most men read a newspaper. In spring, the prairie woke in small, stubborn bursts, patches of green pushing through the brittle remnants of winter. Summer came like a hammer, with sun that bleached the earth and made the horizon shimmer. Autumn carried a strange, wistful beauty, the grass taking on shades of rust and bronze, as if the land itself were quietly preparing for the long sleep of winter. In winter was a test. The wind turned sharp enough to cut, snow drifted against the cabin walls, and the nights seemed to stretch on forever. Those were the nights he most remembered why he had left the world behind. People, he had decided long ago, were not worth the trouble. They carried promises like knives bright in the light, but dangerous if handled too carelessly. He had been cut before. The memories of those cuts were why he stayed out here. In the early years, he'd think about the past often, replaying old conversations, mistakes, and betrayals, like a man tracing scars with his fingers. But as the years passed, the details blurred. Faces became outlines. Voices became faint echoes. Now, the past was like smoke. He could see it in his mind. For a moment, then it slipped away. His only real connection to the outside world came from the sky. Storms rolled in from the west like armies, with black-bellied clouds and the low drum of thunder. He could watch them for hours, tracking their movement, feeling the charge in the air. Lightning would split the horizon, jagged and white, and the smell of rain would rise from the earth like something alive. The storms never frightened him. In fact, they made him feel less alone. The prairie spoke in storms, and he had learned to listen. Once in a long while, he would see riders far off in the distance, too far to recognize, close enough to know they were real. They never came his way. That suited him fine. The one time, in recent memory, someone had ventured close a trapper, in need of water. The cowboy had offered what was asked, nodded once, and watched him right away without inviting conversation. It wasn't that he hated people, it was simply that he no longer needed them. Over 10 years, the land had shaped him as much as he had shaped his life upon it. His skin was weathered to the color of worn leather, his hands thick and calloused, his eyes accustomed to the constant squint against sun and wind. His voice had grown quieter, not out of shyness, but from disuse. Words had become like tools, and his mind brought out only when needed, kept sharp but rarely handled. He did not count the years in numbers, but in winters survived, in roofs patched, in horses born and buried. Time had become something circular rather than linear, like the slow rotation of stars overhead. He lived in the middle of nowhere, and nowhere had claimed him. The thought of returning to a world of noise, crowds, and demands seemed impossible now, as if he'd been away so long that the language had changed and he would no longer understand it. Yet, for all the years of self-imposed exile, there was still a part of him, a small, stubborn ember that remembered what it was like to be needed. He ignored it when it flickered. Solitude was safer. Out here, nothing came to the gate unless the wind blew it there. Out here, life was a bargain between man and land. The land gave enough to live, and in return, he asked nothing more than to be left alone, and for 10 years, that bargain had held. The morning the girls came would shatter it. The afternoon sun lay heavy across the prairie, its light turning the grasses into waves of gold and bronze that shimmered with the mirage of heat. It was the kind of day when the land itself seemed to hold its breath, every sound dulled under the weight of the air. The cowboy sat on his porch, boots propped on the railing, hat pulled low to shade his eyes. A mug of coffee long since gone cold rested in his hand. From here, he could see nearly a mile in each direction. The horizon, broken only by the distant ridge to the west and the silvery ribbon of the dried creek bed to the south. At first, the movement barely registered. Out on the plain, heat shimmer could play tricks on a man's eyes, turning lone fence posts into moving shapes or making low bushes appear to drift. But something about the motion caught his attention. It wasn't the flicker of wind in the grass. This was steady, deliberate, and coming straight toward him. He sat up, squinting against the light, letting his gaze fix on the far-off figures. They were small, yet distinct enough to be more than illusions, and their gait told him something wasn't right. As the seconds passed, his eyes adjusted, and he could make out 4 figures, all on foot. They didn't move like grown men. Their steps were slow, uneven, as if every pace cost them more than they had to give. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, the coffee now forgotten, at his side. The sun flashed on something hair, he thought dark and tangled, shifting as they staggered forward. They were closer now, close enough for him to see they were girls. Native girls, no older than 14 or 15, perhaps younger. Their dresses were torn, the hems ragged with dust and wear. One of them limped heavily, her arms slung over the shoulders of another for balance. Another stumbled outright, catching herself at the last moment before pushing on. Even at this distance, he could tell they were spent, the kind of exhaustion that came not from a long walk alone, but from being driven beyond their limits by fear. The cowboy's mind turned instinctively toward possibilities. Out here, 4 young girls didn't cross the prairie alone without reason. Were they from a nearby camp? Runaways from trouble? Survivors of something worse? He scanned the horizon behind them, searching for riders, dust trails, any sign of pursuit. The land was empty. That didn't comfort him, it only made the situation more mysterious. The wind shifted, carrying with it faint sounds, the scuff of dragging feet, the low murmur of voices in a language he didn't know. They were close enough now for him to see the lines of strain on their faces, the way their shoulders sagged beneath invisible burdens. The leader, or at least the one walking in front, kept her chin lifted, as if holding on to the last threads of dignity, despite her weariness. It was the kind of posture that spoke of both pride and desperation. When they were less than 30 yards from the gate, he saw the moment their strength finally gave out. The first girl's knees buckled, sending her sprawling forward. The others faltered instinctively, trying to help, but their own bodies betrayed them. One by one, they crumpled into the dust, their limbs limp, their chests rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. The air between them shimmered with heat, and the dust clung to their skin, streaking the sweat on their faces. The cowboy's chair scraped against the porch boards as he stood. For years, nothing and no one had come to his gate uninvited. Now, in the space of a breath, the quiet order of his life was broken. He stepped down from the porch and crossed the packed earthyard, boots crunching softly. The gate's latch was warm under his hand, the iron heated by hours in the sun. He swung it open and knelt beside the nearest girl. Up close, their condition was even worse than it had looked from a distance. Their lips were cracked and dry, their skin flushed with heat. Their eyes fluttered open and closed, as if even staying conscious was a battle they might lose. He could smell the dust in their hair, see the way their bare feet were torn and blistered from miles of travel. Whatever had brought them here had driven them hard and given them no time to rest. He touched the nearest girl's shoulder gently, feeling the tremor in her muscles. She was breathing, but shallowly, as though every inhale took effort. Another girl moaned softly, the sound barely audible, and shifted in the dust as if trying to rise but finding her body unwilling to obey. Their exhaustion was absolute. The cowboy's gaze flicked again to the horizon, a lifetime of caution, urging him to look for whatever danger they might have left behind. The emptiness of the land was deceptive. Just because he couldn't see, trouble didn't mean it wasn't out there, moving toward him even now. Still, that could wait. Right now, the only thing certain was that these girls needed help. And though he had spent 10 years building a life free of other people's burdens, something in him buried deep answered without hesitation. He would get them water, he would get them inside, and only then would he start to ask questions. The sight of the 4 girls lying in the dust at his gate was not something the cowboy could just stand and watch. For years, he had trained himself to be still, to let the world's troubles pass him by like clouds over the prairie. But this was different. There was nothing abstract about it. The heat shimmer that had swallowed the horizon all day was now swirling above their small, unmoving bodies, distorting their outlines like a mirage breaking apart. The air was dry enough to burn the back of his throat with every breath, and the dust under his boots was so fine it puffed into the air with each step, clinging to his jeans as he moved forward. He reached the first girl, the one who had led the group before her strength failed. Her hair was black and matted with sweat, strands clinging to her cheeks. Her breathing was shallow, but there was a stubborn rhythm to it like the last steady beat of a drum in an otherwise silent song. When he placed his hand on her shoulder, her skin was hot enough to make him wince. Fever, not the kind born of illness alone, this was heat exhaustion, the cruel companion of too many miles under an unforgiving sun. One by one, he checked the others. The smallest was curled on her side, arms wrapped loosely around her stomach, as if she were trying to hold herself together. Another lay flat on her back, lips cracked and white, eyes half open but unseeing. The last was on her knees, still head bowed, as though she had been praying when her body gave out. All 4 of them had the same sun-browned skin, dulled by dehydration. The same thin, dust-covered clothing, the same telltale tremble in their limbs. He didn't waste time wondering what brought them here. That could wait. Right now, they needed shade, water, and whatever food he could get into them before the desert heat took more than it already had. He slid his arms under the first girl's back and knees, lifting her with the ease of a man who had carried hay bales and fence rails. For most of his life, she was feather-light to light-tanned. He could feel the sharpness of her bones through the torn fabric of her dress. Her head lolled against his chest as he turned and carried her toward the porch. The boards creaked under his boots, the sound echoing oddly in the stillness of the afternoon. Inside, the cabin was cooler, though not by much. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped into the dim interior, where the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds, wood smoke, and the leather of old saddles. In the corner stood his narrow bed, the sheets clean but worn soft from years of use. He laid her down gently, her limbs falling limply into place as if even unconsciousness offered no rest. Without pausing, he went back for the others. The second girl he carried the same way, though she stirred faintly, her lips moving in some soundless word. He caught only the faintest whisper, something in her native tongue, sharp with a tone that might have been fear or pleading. He told her quietly that she was safe, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The words felt strange on his tongue, foreign after so many years of talking to no one. He set her down beside the first, tucking a folded blanket beneath her head. The third and fourth trips were slower. The smallest girl weighed almost nothing, her body limp as a rag doll in his arms. The last girl, the one who had fallen to her knees, was heavier, not from weight but from the way her body refused to bend dizzily in his grip, her muscles locked in some final effort of resistance. By the time he had all 4 inside, sweat was rolling down his back and his breath came in deep pulls. Though he hardly noticed, the cabin felt different now, crowded not by objects but by presence. For a decade, it had been his own. Every chair, every shadow, every creak of the floorboards a familiar part of his private world. Now the air was filled with the uneven sound of 4 young strangers breathing, the faint rustle of their clothes, as they shifted unconsciously, the occasional dry cough. It felt as though the space itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He moved to the corner where an old enamel basin sat atop a wooden stand, filling it with water from the indoor barrel. He tore strips from one of his few clean shirts, soaking them before laying the cool cloths across foreheads and wrists. The water darkened the dust on their skin, making it streak like war paint. The smallest girl stirred at the touch, her eyes flickering open just long enough to meet his before closing again. From the cupboard, he pulled a half loaf of bread and set a pot of thin venison stew back on the stove to warm. He didn't expect them to eat much at first. He knew enough about survival to understand that food could shock a starving body if given too soon. Water came first. He poured it into a tin cup, kneeling to lift each girl's head just enough to tip a few swallows past her lips. Most of it they swallowed without thought, the instinct for water stronger than any caution. One girl choked briefly, coughing against the rim of the cup, but she clung to it as though afraid it would be taken away. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, the light slanting through the single window to cast long bars across the floor. He could see the dust motes floating in the beam, lazy and slow, as though the world beyond the cabin had not just changed forever, but inside he felt the shift keenly. Something had crossed his gate for someone's. In fact, and with them had come the return of a duty he had long buried. Still, there was no regret in his movements, no hesitation now. The choice had already been made the moment he stepped off the porch. They were here, and that meant they were under his roof. And in the unwritten law of the prairie, that made them his to protect at least until they could stand on their own again. It was hours before the first signs of life returned. The cabin had settled into a strange, watchful silence, broken only by the soft crackle of the stove and the uneven rhythm of 4 exhausted bodies, breathing in their uneasy rest. The cowboy sat in the only chair near the bed, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the girls as if willing them to wake. The day outside had shifted from the heavy glare of afternoon to the softer, deeper light of evening, but inside, the dimness seemed unchanged. Then, without warning, the girl nearest to him stirred. Her lashes fluttered long dark, dust clumped and her breathing hitched. For a moment she seemed caught between sleep and waking, her gaze moving beneath closed lids as though chasing something in a dream. When her eyes finally opened, they were deep and dark, like a well whose bottom you couldn't see. They darted around the room, taking in the cabin walls, the low ceiling, the shadowed corners, and finally landing on him. Her first instinct was fear. He saw it in the way her pupils widened, in the subtle tightening of her jaw, in how her shoulders tensed, even though her body was too weak to move. The cowboy didn't shift in his seat. Sudden movements would only make things worse. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and calm, the same tone he used to settle a skittish horse. "You're safe here," he said. The words were plain, but they hung in the air between them like a bridge he hoped she would cross. She didn't answer, not in English. Anyway, instead, her lips formed a single word, soft as a sigh. He didn't know the language, but he caught the shape of it, the way it carried weight far greater than its sound. It was a name. He glanced toward the other girls, realizing they must be connected sisters, perhaps, or close enough to be as good as blood. The name had the sound of worry in it, the kind of word spoken when you're checking to see if someone dear to you is still breathing. He gave a small nod toward them, letting her see they were all still there, all still alive. Some of the tension eased from her face, though her eyes remained guarded. She swallowed with difficulty, as if even that was an effort, and shifted her gaze toward the doorway. Instinctively, he followed her look, but the open door showed nothing but the fading light over the yard. Still, he understood what she was feeling. The fear wasn't gone, it was simply waiting, crouched in the back of her mind. Whatever had driven them here hadn't been left entirely behind. As the minutes passed, the others stirred as well, roused by the sound of movement or by some silent connection between them. They woke in fragments, half-lidded eyes, shallow breaths, whispers in their own tongue. The cowboy didn't press them for answers. From the way they glanced toward the horizon, through the window, from the way their voices caught when they spoke, he could begin to piece together a story without needing the full telling. They had been running, for how long? He couldn't guess, but their bodies bore the marks of it. Torn clothes, raw feet, the dull glaze of exhaustion that comes from more than just distance. When one of them met his gaze directly, he gave the smallest nod, as if to say he understood enough. For now, the details could wait. Rest came first, and safety, real safety, the kind they hadn't known in far too long, would take more than his word to prove. That would come with time, if time was something the land allowed them. The cabin had taken on a strange stillness after the girls fell back into an easy rest. Outside, the sun was lowering, and the last of the heat was bleeding away into a softer, cooler wind that stirred the prairie grass in long, whispering waves. But the cowboy wasn't thinking about the evening breeze or the coming night. His eyes were on the horizon. He stood on the porch, rifle resting lightly across his forearms. It wasn't a posture of hunting, it was one of readiness, the stance of a man who knew how quickly peace could turn to trouble. He had lived 10 years without looking for danger. But now every shadow seemed worth noting, every shift in the wind worth listening to. Out here, the land itself could tell you when something was wrong, and tonight, it was speaking in that quiet, watchful way he hadn't felt in years. Something deep inside him, something he had long ago thought dead, was awake again. He recognized it immediately, the same feeling he'd had in younger days when he rode guard for cattle herds at night, listening for the snap of a twig or the distant thud of hooves that didn't belong. It was the same instinct that made a man step forward instead of turning away when others were at risk. He told himself it was just practicality. The girls were here, under his roof, and that meant any trouble looking for them might come to his gate. But he knew it was more than that. He had carried them into the cabin with his own hands. He had given them water from his own barrel, laid them on his own bed. Whether he liked it or not, they were his responsibility now. The sky deepened into shades of copper and violet as the sun slid behind the ridge. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their voices carrying across the open land. Somewhere to the south, a lone hawk called once, then fell silent. The cowboy's gaze swept the empty grassland again. He saw nothing, no riders, no dust trails, but the absence didn't comfort him. Trouble could move quietly when it wanted to. When the last of the light faded and the stars began to burn in the darkening sky, he stepped back into the cabin and set the rifle within easy reach by the door. He dropped the heavy iron bolt into place, the deep clunk of it echoing in the small space. Then he walked to the corral, securing the gate so his horse would be close at hand if they needed to leave quickly. He was already thinking in terms of 10 years of living alone, and now every plan he made included 4 strangers. Dawn came quietly over the prairie, not with a sudden burst of light but with a gradual lifting of the darkness. The first sign was the paling of the eastern horizon, a faint wash of silver blue above the grasslands, followed by the soft, low chorus of meadowlarks stirring in the distance. Inside the cabin, the cowboy had been awake long before the light came. Sleep had been thin for him, broken by the creak of the walls in the cooling night air and the occasional soft cough from one of the girls. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke from the stove and of the clean, damp cloths he had used to cool their fevered skin. The girls were stirring now, with the restless movements of discomfort, but with the slow, tentative waking of those whose bodies had fought for every hour of rest. The smallest one blinked against the light filtering through the single window, rubbing at her eyes with a hand that still trembled. Another shifted to sit up, pressing her palm to the floor for balance, her long hair falling forward to hide her face. Their eyes looked clearer, but still wary, as if they were not sure yet if the safety of the night would last into the day. The cowboy pushed himself away from the chair he had slept in and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and the distant dampness of the creek bed. He let his gaze sweep the land, the same way he always did, expecting the horizon to be empty as it had been every morning for the last decade. But it wasn't empty, at first. What he saw looked like a shadow stretched along the ground far to the west. Then the light shifted, and the shadow became movement. A line of figures was coming toward his gate, their pace slow but steady. As they drew closer, the shapes resolved into people-men, a great many of them. Even at this distance, he could see the glint of morning light on metal, the dark fall of hair, the unmistakable straightness of warriors walking in unison. His hand went instinctively to the rifle resting just inside the doorway, but he didn't raise it. Something about their approach didn't carry the feel of a charge or an ambush. They walked as if they had been traveling for hours already, their steps measured, their weapons at their sides rather than in their hands. When they reached the boundary of his land, they stopped. There must have been 50, no, closer to 100 standing in a silent, unmoving line. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind sliding through the grass. Then, as one, they bowed their heads. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight he could feel in his chest. It wasn't submission, it wasn't threat, it was something else, entirely acknowledgement, gratitude, maybe even trust. He didn't need anyone to tell him why they were here. The answer was resting inside his cabin. 4 young lives that had stumbled to his gate the day before. For the first time in 10 years, he realized the world had come to him not to take, not to demand, but to give thanks. And in that quiet dawn, light, with the prairie stretching endless around them, the cowboy knew his decade of solitude had ended.